In the frozen wilderness of Alaska, where temperatures plummet to -40 degrees and visibility drops to mere feet, most people would consider survival impossible. But on December 15th, 1952, when a military transport plane carrying 23 souls vanished into a raging blizzard, one man refused to accept that impossible meant hopeless. What followed was a rescue mission that would push human endurance to its absolute limits and prove that sometimes the difference between life and death comes down to a single person's unwillingness to give up. This is the true story of how Sergeant Michael Torres turned what should have been a routine supply run into the most daring rescue operation in Alaskan history. The morning of December 15th, 1952, began like any other at Elmendorf Air Force Base near Anchorage, Alaska. Sergeant Michael Torres had been stationed there for 18 months, long enough to understand that Alaska didn't forgive mistakes. The 32-year-old from New Mexico had earned respect among his fellow servicemen for his methodical approach to everything he did. Whether it was maintaining aircraft engines or planning supply runs to remote outposts, Torres never rushed and never cut corners. The C-47 transport plane sat on the frozen tarmac, its engines warming up in the bitter morning air. Captain James Sullivan, the pilot, reviewed the flight plan one final time with his co-pilot, Lieutenant Robertson. They were scheduled to deliver medical supplies, food, and winter gear to 3 remote research stations scattered across the Alaskan interior. It was a routine mission that dozens of crews had completed safely over the years. Torres supervised the loading of the cargo, checking each item against his manifest. The plane carried enough supplies to last the research stations through the next 2 months of brutal winter weather. Among the passengers were Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a civilian meteorologist heading to Weather Station Alpha, and Corporal David Kim, who was being transferred to the communications post at Station Charlie. As the C-47 taxied toward the runway, weather reports indicated deteriorating conditions to the east. However, the storm wasn't expected to reach their route for several hours, giving them a comfortable safety margin. Captain Sullivan had over 2,000 hours of flight experience in Alaskan conditions, and the aircraft had been thoroughly inspected just 2 days earlier. The takeoff proceeded normally, and for the first hour of flight, everything went according to plan. Torres monitored radio communications while keeping an eye on the cargo securing straps. The landscape below stretched endlessly, a white wilderness broken only by the occasional mountain peak or frozen river. This was Alaska at its most beautiful and most dangerous. At 11:30 a.m., approximately 150 miles northeast of Anchorage, Captain Sullivan noticed the first signs of trouble. The weather front was moving faster than predicted, and visibility was beginning to decrease. He contacted Elmendorf Base to report the change in conditions and request an updated weather briefing. The radio crackled with static as the base weather officer confirmed that the storm had indeed accelerated. Wind speeds were now reaching 60 miles per hour, with heavy snow and near-zero visibility expected within the hour. Captain Sullivan made the decision to alter course slightly, hoping to skirt the worst of the weather system. But nature had other plans. Within 20 minutes, the C-47 was enveloped in a wall of snow and ice. The wind buffeted the aircraft violently, making it difficult for Sullivan to maintain level flight. Ice began forming on the wings, adding dangerous weight and reducing lift. The radio transmissions became increasingly garbled as electrical interference from the storm intensified. Dr. Mitchell, who had been studying weather patterns in the region for 3 years, recognized the severity of their situation. She moved forward to speak with the pilots, offering her knowledge of local weather systems. According to her observations, they were flying directly into what meteorologists called a bomb cyclone, a rapidly intensifying storm that could produce hurricane-force winds and blizzard conditions. Captain Sullivan made the difficult decision to attempt an emergency landing. Through breaks in the swirling snow, he spotted what appeared to be a relatively flat area near a frozen lake. It wasn't ideal, But with ice continuing to accumulate on the aircraft and fuel running lower than he'd like, options were becoming limited. The approach was treacherous. Crosswinds pushed the plane sideways, forcing Sullivan to make constant corrections. The landing gear touched down hard on the uneven ground, and the aircraft bounced twice before settling. The left main gear caught in a hidden depression, and the plane ground-looped, spinning around before coming to rest against a stand of snow-laden spruce trees. For a moment, silence filled the cabin except for the howling wind outside. Then, Torres began moving through the aircraft, checking on passengers and crew. Miraculously, no one had been seriously injured, though several people had minor cuts and bruises. The real concern became immediately apparent when Captain Sullivan attempted to restart the engines. The left engine had been damaged in the landing, and the right engine wouldn't turn over in the extreme cold. Outside, the storm raged with increasing fury. Snow fell so heavily that they couldn't see more than a few feet beyond the aircraft windows. The wind chill was dropping the effective temperature to nearly minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside the unheated plane, their breath began to form clouds, and frost started accumulating on the windows. Torres took charge of organizing their resources. They had emergency food rations for 5 days, several sleeping bags, and basic survival gear. The medical supplies meant for the research stations included antibiotics and pain medication, which could prove valuable. Most importantly, they had a portable radio, though atmospheric conditions made communication extremely difficult. Dr. Mitchell worked with Torres to assess their situation scientifically. Based on her knowledge of the storm pattern, the blizzard could continue for anywhere from 12 hours to 3 days. The research stations they had been flying to were all at least 50 miles away, too far to reach on foot in these conditions. Their only hope was that search and rescue teams would be able to locate them once the weather cleared. As the first day stretched into evening, the temperature inside the aircraft continued to drop. They consolidated into the main cabin, using cargo parachutes and canvas to create a smaller space they could keep marginally warmer with body heat. Torres instituted strict rationing of food and water, knowing they might need to survive for several days. The radio operator, Specialist Janet Rodriguez, worked tirelessly to establish contact with any station. Occasionally, she managed to get through for a few seconds at a time, long enough to transmit their approximate location before static overwhelmed the signal. These brief transmissions would prove crucial, as they provided search teams with a general area to focus their efforts. By the second day, their situation had become critical. The storm showed no signs of abating, and the cold was beginning to take its toll. Several passengers were showing early signs of hypothermia, despite their efforts to stay warm. Torres made the difficult decision to organize the group into sleeping shifts, with some people staying awake to ensure that those sleeping didn't slip too deeply into unconsciousness. It was during this second night that Torres first heard the sound that would change everything. Through the howling wind, he detected what seemed like the distant drone of aircraft engines. He woke Rodriguez immediately, and she began broadcasting distress signals with increased urgency. The sound faded after several minutes, but Torres was certain he had heard something. The next morning brought a slight improvement in weather conditions. The snow was still falling, but the wind had decreased somewhat, improving visibility to perhaps 30 feet. Torres and Corporal Kim ventured outside to assess their surroundings more thoroughly. What they discovered was both encouraging and terrifying. They had landed in a remote valley surrounded by mountains, which provided some shelter from the worst of the wind, but also made them nearly invisible to search aircraft. However, Torres noticed something else. In the distance, barely visible through the snow, he could make out what appeared to be a small structure. It was too far to reach safely in current conditions, but it represented hope, possibly an abandoned cabin or shelter that might offer better protection than the aircraft. As they prepared for what might be their final night, Torres gathered everyone together. He spoke quietly but firmly about their situation, acknowledging the danger while maintaining focus on survival. They had made it this far, through cooperation and careful resource management. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. Unknown to the survivors, their brief radio transmissions had indeed been received. At Elmendorf Air Force Base, Sergeant Michael Torres' best friend and fellow mechanic, Staff Sergeant Carlos Mendoza, had been following the search efforts with growing desperation. The official search and rescue operations had been grounded due to weather conditions, but Mendoza was already formulating a plan that would either save his friend's life or cost him his own. At Elmendorf Air Force Base, the atmosphere was tense with controlled urgency. In the operations center, Colonel Robert Hayes studied weather maps and search grids with increasing frustration. It had been 48 hours since the C-47's last confirmed radio contact, and official search operations remained grounded due to the continuing storm system. The blizzard that had claimed the transport plane showed no signs of weakening. Staff Sergeant Carlos Mendoza paced the communications room, listening to every radio transmission and weather update. He and Torres had served together for 3 years, sharing everything from weekend fishing trips to the responsibilities of maintaining the base's aircraft. Mendoza knew Torres better than anyone. If his friend was alive, he would be doing everything possible to keep his fellow passengers safe. The problem was that everything possible might not be enough. Temperature readings from the search area indicated sustained sub-zero conditions, with wind chills approaching -70 degrees. Even with the aircraft providing shelter, survival time was limited without proper heating. The emergency rations on board would last perhaps 5 days, but hypothermia would likely claim lives well before starvation became a factor. Dr. Patricia Hawkins, the base medical officer, had been calculating survival probabilities based on the conditions. Her analysis was grim, but not hopeless. In the protected environment of the aircraft, with proper rationing and by sharing body heat, the survivors could potentially last up to a week. However, this assumed no serious injuries from the crash and perfect cooperation among all passengers. Mendoza had been thinking along different lines. While the brass focused on official search protocols and weather windows, he studied topographical maps of the region where Torres had disappeared. The area was a maze of valleys and ridges, with several abandoned mining camps and seasonal shelters scattered throughout. If the plane had gone down in the right location, there might be additional resources available to the survivors. On the third morning after the crash, Mendoza made a decision that would define the rest of his military career. He approached Chief Master Sergeant Williams, his immediate supervisor, with a proposal that bordered on insubordination. Mendoza wanted to take one of the base's ski-equipped aircraft and conduct an unauthorized search mission. The weather's still too dangerous for standard operations, Williams pointed out, reviewing the meteorological data. We're looking at visibility under a quarter mile and winds gusting to 40 knots. Mendoza had anticipated this objection. He spread out detailed maps of the region, showing potential landing sites and shelter locations. Sir, I've been studying Torres' probable flight path. If they went down here, he pointed to a valley roughly 160 miles northeast of base. There's an old prospector's cabin about 2 miles from the most likely crash site. Williams examined the maps more carefully. Mendoza had done his homework, identifying not just the cabin, but also several other potential resources, an abandoned logging camp, a seasonal ranger station, and even a cache of emergency supplies that had been pre-positioned for exactly this type of situation. Even if you could find them, Williams continued, how would you get them out? That aircraft you're talking about taking can carry maybe 6 people maximum in these conditions. This was where Mendoza's plan became truly audacious. Rather than attempting an immediate evacuation, he proposed establishing a supply line to the survivors. Using the ski-equipped plane, he could deliver food, medical supplies, heating fuel, and communication equipment that would allow the survivors to wait for better weather conditions. The plan required approval from Colonel Hayes, who initially rejected it outright. The risk of losing another aircraft and crew was unacceptable, especially when weather conditions remained so dangerous. However, Mendoza persisted, eventually proposing a compromise that would minimize risk while maximizing the chance of reaching the survivors. Instead of flying alone, Mendoza would take Dr. Hawkins as a medical officer and Sergeant Lisa Park, the base's most experienced cold-weather survival instructor. The mission would be strictly limited: locate the survivors, deliver emergency supplies, and return immediately. No heroic rescue attempts, no extended ground operations. Colonel Hayes gave conditional approval, with the understanding that the mission would launch only if weather conditions improved enough to provide a reasonable safety margin. They would have a 6-hour window, enough time to reach the search area, locate the crash site, and return before the next weather front moved through. Meanwhile, in the crash C-47, Torres and his fellow survivors were fighting their own battle against time and the elements. The structure Torres had spotted through the snow had indeed proven to be an abandoned cabin, but reaching it required a dangerous trek across uneven terrain in near-whiteout conditions. Dr. Mitchell had been tracking weather patterns and believed they might have a brief window of improved visibility. Working with Torres, she identified the safest route to the cabin, following a frozen creek bed that would provide both directional guidance and some protection from the wind. The decision to leave the aircraft was not made lightly. The plane provided known shelter, while the cabin was an unknown quantity that might be damaged, occupied by wildlife, or lacking basic necessities. However, Torres recognized that their current situation was slowly becoming untenable. Despite their best efforts to conserve body heat, several passengers were showing advanced signs of cold exposure. Corporal Kim volunteered to make the initial trek to the cabin, carrying minimal supplies, but enough emergency gear to survive if he became lost or injured. The round trip would take approximately 4 hours in good conditions, but could stretch much longer if he encountered obstacles or became disoriented. Kim departed at first light on the 4th day, following the frozen creek bed as planned. He carried a basic survival kit, emergency food for 2 days, and, most importantly, a length of rope that he could use to establish a guideline between the aircraft and the cabin. If the cabin proved suitable, this rope would allow the entire group to make the transfer safely, even in poor visibility. 3 hours after Kim's departure, those remaining in the aircraft heard the distant sound of aircraft engines again. This time, however, the sound was much clearer and seemed to be getting closer. Rodriguez immediately began broadcasting emergency signals, while Torres and the others used reflective materials to create visual signals outside the aircraft. The sound of engines grew stronger, then began to fade as the aircraft passed beyond their location. However, 15 minutes later, they heard the engines returning, this time from a different direction. Someone was conducting a systematic search pattern, getting closer with each pass. Torres made the critical decision to ignite one of their emergency flares. The bright red signal shot skyward through the falling snow, creating a distinctive signature that would be visible to any aircraft in the area. Within minutes, they heard the engines again, this time accompanied by the sound of the aircraft descending. Mendoza's unauthorized search mission had found its target. Flying the ski-equipped aircraft in conditions that stretched both his skills and the aircraft's capabilities, he had been systematically searching the valley where Torres' plane had most likely gone down. The emergency flare provided the precise location he needed. Landing in the deep snow near the crash site required all of Mendoza's experience and more than a little luck. The aircraft touched down hard, bounced twice, and skidded sideways before coming to rest approximately 200 yards from the crash C-47. As soon as the engine stopped, Mendoza, Dr. Hawkins, and Sergeant Park began unloading emergency supplies. The reunion between Torres and Mendoza was brief, but emotional. Both men understood that this was only the beginning of their challenges, not the end. The rescue aircraft could carry only 3 passengers in addition to the crew, meaning multiple trips would be necessary to evacuate everyone. However, the weather window was already beginning to close, with visibility decreasing and wind speeds increasing. Dr. Hawkins quickly assessed the condition of all survivors. While no one required immediate life-threatening medical attention, several passengers were suffering from moderate hypothermia and minor injuries. More concerning was the general level of exhaustion and dehydration among the group. Torres briefed Mendoza on Corporal Kim's mission to the cabin. If Kim had successfully reached the shelter and found it suitable, the cabin could serve as a staging area for the evacuation. The better shelter and additional supplies would give them more time to conduct a safe and methodical rescue operation. As if summoned by their conversation, Kim appeared through the snow, following his rope guideline back to the aircraft. His report was encouraging. The cabin was structurally sound, had a working fireplace, and contained basic supplies including canned food, blankets, and kerosene for heating. Most importantly, it had a small cleared area nearby where the rescue aircraft could land more safely than at the current location. The decision was made quickly. Using Kim's guideline as navigation, the entire group would move to the cabin immediately. The rescue aircraft would follow, relocating to the better landing site near the shelter. From there, they could conduct the evacuation in safer conditions with proper shelter and heating available. The trek to the cabin tested everyone's remaining strength, but Torres' leadership and the group's cooperation enabled them to complete the move without incident. Within 2 hours, all survivors were warm and safe in the cabin, while Mendoza's aircraft was secured at the new location. However, their challenges were far from over. Weather reports indicated another major storm system approaching, with potentially worse conditions than they had already experienced. The window for evacuation was rapidly closing, and difficult decisions lay ahead about who would leave first and who would wait for subsequent rescue flights. Inside the prospector's cabin, warmth returned to bodies that had known only bitter cold for 4 days. The fireplace crackled with seasoned wood that Kim had discovered stacked against one wall, and for the first time since the crash, the survivors could remove their outer layers of clothing without immediately shivering. Dr. Hawkins moved efficiently among them, treating frostbite, checking core temperatures, and administering fluids to combat dehydration. Mendoza studied the weather reports Dr. Hawkins had brought from the base. The approaching storm system was massive, potentially lasting up to 5 days with conditions even worse than what they had already endured. If they were going to evacuate anyone, it had to happen within the next 6 hours. After that, they would all be trapped until the weather cleared. Torres gathered his fellow survivors to explain the situation honestly. The rescue aircraft could safely carry 3 passengers plus the rescue crew on each trip. With weather closing in, there might be time for only 2 flights before conditions became too dangerous. This meant some people would have to remain at the cabin until the storm passed, while others could leave immediately. The decision about who would go first sparked intense discussion. Dr. Mitchell, despite being a civilian, argued that she should remain since her meteorological knowledge could be valuable for timing future evacuation attempts. Captain Sullivan, still feeling responsible for his passengers, insisted that crew members should be the last to leave. Torres found himself in the unexpected position of having to make life-or-death decisions for people who weren't under his military command. However, his natural leadership and the respect he had earned during their ordeal gave weight to his words when he proposed a practical solution. The first flight would take the 3 passengers who were showing the most severe effects of cold exposure, regardless of rank or position. Dr. Hawkins would accompany them to provide medical care during the flight. The second flight would evacuate the remaining civilians, while military personnel would wait for the third flight after the storm passed. This decision was not popular with everyone, particularly Captain Sullivan, who felt his responsibility as aircraft commander required him to ensure all passengers reached safety first. However, Torres pointed out that Sullivan's piloting expertise might be valuable if they encountered any problems with the rescue aircraft, making his presence potentially crucial for everyone's survival. As Mendoza prepared for the first evacuation flight, he received a radio transmission from Elmendorf base that changed the entire dynamic of the rescue operation. Colonel Hayes informed him that a second rescue aircraft was en route, piloted by Major Jennifer Walsh, one of the most experienced Arctic pilots in the Air Force. The arrival of the second aircraft meant they could potentially evacuate everyone before the storm hit. However, it also meant that two aircraft would be operating in increasingly dangerous conditions, doubling the risk of another crash. Mendoza made the decision to proceed with the original plan for the first flight, while waiting to see if conditions would allow the second aircraft to reach them safely. The first evacuation flight departed the cabin's makeshift landing strip just as snow began falling again. Dr. Hawkins accompanied the three most vulnerable survivors, including an older civilian contractor who had developed symptoms of pneumonia. The flight back to Elmendorf would take 90 minutes in current conditions, with Mendoza pushing the aircraft's capabilities to stay ahead of the approaching weather front. Torres used the time, while waiting for the second aircraft, to organize the cabin for extended occupancy. If weather prevented further evacuation attempts, the remaining survivors might need to stay for several more days. He worked with Kim and the others to inventory supplies, establish communication schedules with the base, and prepare for another siege by the elements. Major Walsh's aircraft appeared through the snow 40 minutes after Mendoza's departure, her approach complicated by deteriorating visibility and increasing wind. The landing was rough, with the aircraft sliding sideways before coming to rest near the cabin. Walsh emerged from the cockpit with grim news. This would definitely be the last flight out before the storm made further operations impossible. The aircraft could carry 4 passengers, meaning one person would still need to remain at the cabin. Without hesitation, Torres volunteered to stay behind. His reasoning was practical. He had the most cold-weather survival experience. The cabin was well-stocked with supplies, and someone needed to maintain radio communication with the base during the storm. However, Captain Sullivan refused to accept this arrangement. As the pilot of the crashed aircraft, he felt ultimate responsibility for ensuring all his passengers reached safety. The argument between the two men grew heated until Dr. Mitchell proposed a different solution. She pointed out that the cabin was actually quite comfortable with adequate food and fuel. Rather than viewing the situation as someone being left behind, they could frame it as someone staying to secure the location and maintain communication. The person remaining would be in no immediate danger and could be evacuated easily once the weather cleared. This perspective changed the discussion completely. Several people volunteered to remain, recognizing that staying at the cabin was no longer a hardship, but rather a reasonable precaution. Torres ultimately remained, not as someone being abandoned, but as the logical choice to serve as base camp coordinator. Major Walsh's aircraft departed just as the first heavy snow band from the new storm began moving through the area. Within an hour, visibility had dropped to near zero, and wind speeds reached dangerous levels. Torres settled into the cabin for what would be a solitary but comfortable wait for better weather. Over the next 4 days, Torres maintained regular radio contact with Elmendorf base, providing weather observations and confirming his continued safety. The cabin proved to be exceptionally well supplied, with enough food, fuel, and reading material to last for weeks if necessary. Rather than being an ordeal, his solo stay became almost pleasant, the first quiet, warm, and peaceful time he had experienced since the original crash. The storm finally broke on the 5th day, revealing a landscape transformed by enormous snow drifts and crystal-clear skies. Mendoza arrived to collect Torres within hours of receiving the all-clear weather report. The flight back to Elmendorf was routine, a stark contrast to the dramatic rescue operations of the previous week. The investigation into the crash revealed that the crew had made all the right decisions given the information available to them. The sudden intensification of the storm system had been nearly impossible to predict with 1952 weather forecasting technology. Captain Sullivan was commended for his skill in executing the emergency landing under extremely difficult conditions. Mendoza faced potential disciplinary action for his unauthorized rescue mission, but the successful outcome and Colonel Hayes' recognition of the mission's necessity resulted in him receiving a commendation instead. His willingness to risk his own life and career to save fellow service members exemplified the best traditions of military service. Dr. Mitchell used her experience during the crash and rescue to develop new protocols for Arctic weather forecasting, potentially preventing similar incidents in the future. Her research contributed to improved survival rates for personnel operating in extreme cold weather environments. The C-47 itself was eventually recovered the following spring and returned to service after extensive repairs. The aircraft flew for another 15 years before being retired, carrying a small plaque in the cockpit commemorating the survival and rescue of its crew and passengers in December 1952. For Torres, the experience reinforced his belief in the importance of preparation, leadership, and never giving up hope even in the most desperate circumstances. He remained in the Air Force for another 20 years, eventually becoming a survival training instructor himself. His first lesson to new students was always the same: survival isn't about being the strongest or the smartest. It's about being willing to take care of the people around you, one day at a time, until help arrives. The rescue mission became legendary within the Air Force, not just for its successful outcome, but for the way it demonstrated how individual initiative and courage could overcome seemingly impossible odds. Mendoza and Torres remained close friends for the rest of their lives, their bond strengthened by the knowledge that when it mattered most, they had been there for each other. Years later, when asked about the most important factor in their survival, Torres would always give the same answer: we never stopped believing that someone was coming for us, and we never stopped taking care of each other. Everything else was just details.